Hi, Blaze here again, and welcome to the first alternative to punishment. So this first alternative to punishment is the most important one because this sets the foundation for the rest of them. The first alternative to punishment is your commitment, your intention to no longer using punishments as a form of discipline for your children. You don't want to use threats. You don't want to use punishments to try to get your child just to cooperate and behave properly, do you? Right? That's why you're watching this e-course to begin with. So first off, you have to make the firm commitment, the firm decision, the firm intention within yourself, and have the unwavering intention that no matter what, you're no longer going to raise your voice. You're no longer going to use punishments or threats to discipline your child. And don't worry, if you've used these before in order to get your child just to listen to you and you don't know how to get them to listen or to behave without raising your voice or using threats, you're going to learn how to do this in this online course. But first, just make the decision to yourself. Make the commitment and hold the intention inside of yourself to no longer resort to punishments. So I'm going to tell you why it's so important not to use punishments. First off, you have to understand a basic principle of democratic parenting is that there's two spectrums of parenting, right? On one spectrum, we have what we call permissive parents. And on the other spectrum, we have what we call authoritarian parents, okay? So on one side are the permissive parents who are overly permissive. They let their children walk all over them. They give their children too much power. Okay, they let their children get away with too many things. They don't set firm and secure limits or boundaries with their children. And if they do try to set limits, the children easily walk all over them, and then the permissive parent just lets them do that. Now, the thing is, after a while, all permissive parents get fed up and overwhelmed and don't know what to do any longer, so then they'll swing to the opposite end of the spectrum and use a type of authoritarian discipline in order to try to get their children to behave. On the other side of the spectrum, the authoritarian parents are overly strict. And they can be harsh in their communication, right? They can be domineering and they can hold all the power here. So on one side of the spectrum, the permissive parents gives their children too much power. On the other side, the authoritarian parents, they hold too much power. They don't give their children enough power, okay? So these are the two ends of the spectrum. And the balance in between them is what we call democratic parenting. Okay, my entire book, Democratic Parenting, and a lot of my work is involved on how to balance these two spectrums. Because sometimes we need to be permissive, right? We need to allow our children to do things, to experience the responsibility that comes with having power. This will meet their need for autonomy, and it meets their developmental needs in order to be responsible with power, in order to deal with and to learn from the natural consequences of the decisions that they make, right? But at the same time, we need to be an authority to guide them along the way. And if our children start to behave in ways which are unacceptable, which are not healthy for them or for anybody else, we need to be an authority to provide them a positive direction and help them find more positive and group-orientated solutions to get to the next level in whatever is going on, so that everybody's needs are met, not just the child's and not just one person's. Okay, and that's the key. We want our children to think situationally, to see everybody and all the circumstances that are involved in any given situation and come to the correct and right decisions for everybody involved. And the way to do that is to allow them the opportunity to experience the responsibility of making decisions, of having autonomy and having power in situations that allow for that. Because sometimes it's not the situation to give them power and allow them decisions, right? If they want to have every toy, or if they want to have a candy or a sweet, or if they want to do something and our time doesn't permit us to do that, then that's not the time to allow them to experience the power and to learn from that. So we have to be an authority to guide them appropriately so they can learn how to deal with these different situations appropriately and make sure that all the situational needs are met, and so that there's a win-win-win for everybody involved. So we're going to show you how to do this. But first and foremost, you have to make the decision and the commitment within yourself to no longer use threats or punishments. Instead, we're going to use the techniques that you're going to learn in the later videos in this Alternative to Punishment e-course. Also, you can read my book, Democratic Parenting, that talks a lot about the techniques and methodology used to relate to your children, to communicate to your children, to set appropriate limits with your children, to meet their needs, to help them resolve stress and other types of issues that can hijack their behavior. Okay? Speaking of hijacking, this is an important thing we want to talk about when understanding what's wrong with threats and punishments. Okay, so let's talk about that. The thing that's wrong with threats and punishments is that they evoke fear in a child. Anytime a child feels fear, then this will cause their brain to go into what is called the amygdala part of the brain. The amygdala part is it's like the brain stem. That's the survival instinct. It's often called the lizard brain because reptiles have an amygdala part of their brain, and this is responsible for their basic autonomic functions, temperature regulation, and their sleep, eating, digestion. It's also their instincts and their survival drive, right? This is what causes the fight or flight response, where adrenaline and cortisol gets released into the system in order to survive a dangerous situation, in order to fight some type of threat, or to run from a threat that threatens their very survival. This is an instinctual drive that all of our species and animals have inside their brains, and it's ruled by the amygdala part of the brain, which is the brainstem. Now, lizards and reptiles do not have a frontal cortex, okay, but humans do, and this is the frontal cortex, and this is involved in our higher thinking. It has to do with our judgment, with our memory recall, with language and communication and clear thinking, okay? So what happens though, this is a very interesting thing to understand. We need to understand this and know this to see why punishments and threats are actually not good for our children's behavior in the long term, is because whenever they feel threatened, whenever they are afraid of a punishment, then the fear will cause them to go into the amygdala part of their brain, and the amygdala will shut down the frontal cortex. We call that amygdala hijacking. It's a very well-known phenomenon called amygdala hijacking, where the survival part takes over the higher thinking and people don't think clearly. And I'm sure in your own life, you can remember several instances or circumstances where you got emotional or upset or fearful, and then you did things or said things where you thought about it afterwards and you said, why did I say those things? It just caused more problems or it caused more pain, and you realize, geez, there's something wrong. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't have really good judgment at the time because I was so emotional, okay? And that's what happens. That's the amygdala part of the brain hijacking the frontal cortex. So the children have this exact same response. So we want to avoid that amygdala hijacking, help them get out of the survival, instinctual, fear-driven part of the brain and get them to the frontal cortex. And that's what's going to allow them to have better memory recall, so that when you're trying to teach them rules, when you're trying to teach them appropriate behavior, if they're in the amygdala part of their brain, if they feel threatened and they're afraid because they know a punishment is coming, they're not going to be able to remember the actual lesson that you're trying to teach them, as well as they would be able to remember that if you communicated that to them in a way that they did not feel threatened, where they're not fearing a punishment. That way they can stay in the frontal cortex and they can understand the situational needs and why it is you're communicating this to them, why it is their behavior was inappropriate. And they will be able to remember a more appropriate response for the next time that a similar situation might arise, okay? So this is why threats and punishments are ineffective in the long term, because they don't allow the children to remember the deeper fundamental needs, okay, in a way that they can recall it more easily. It will take more repetition when they're in the amygdala part of the brain, because they don't have that frontal cortex memory recall that they would have if they're calm and they feel safe and they feel that life is good and all their needs are met and they feel connected to you, the adult caregiver, okay? And that's the other thing we're going to talk about in the next videos, is how to influence children, how to communicate to children in a way that they can remember these things, in a way that they don't feel threatened, in a way that you can put a clear limit down on their negative or inappropriate behavior and direct them, redirect them, and guide them towards better behavior. How do we do that? We're going to talk about that in the next videos. Until the next video, remember, every single day. Give your children all your love and give yourself that same love too, because you deserve it as well. And together, we truly can build a brighter future.